Before there was a nation, there was a farm. Before there was a founding father, there was a boy walking the frost-hardened fields of Braintree, Massachusetts, learning the particular stubbornness that New England soil demands of those who work it. The story of John Adams begins not in the gilded halls of power, not in the revolutionary fire of Philadelphia, but here, on a modest stretch of coastal farmland south of Boston, where the Atlantic wind comes in cold and uncompromising, and where the land itself seems to insist on honesty. John Adams was born on October 30, 1735, in a small saltbox house in Braintree that his family had occupied for generations. He was the son of Deacon John Adams and Susanna Boylston, and he represented the fifth generation of his family in America, tracing his lineage back to Henry Adams, who had crossed from England to these shores in 1633. The Adams family was not wealthy by any measure that the colonial world recognized. They were farmers and craftsmen, people of modest means and enormous dignity, whose standing in the community rested not on inherited fortune, but on demonstrated character. The deacon was a man of local consequence, a church elder, a selectman, a man whose word meant something in Braintree, and he raised his eldest son with the expectation that education would be the instrument of advancement. The landscape of Adams's childhood was one of granite outcroppings and salt marsh, of apple orchards and stone walls built by generations of hands that understood permanence. Braintree sat on the south shore of Massachusetts Bay, close enough to Boston to feel the gravitational pull of that city's commerce and politics, but far enough removed to maintain its own rhythms of planting and harvest, of church and community. It was a world that valued self-reliance above sentiment, that measured a man by the quality of his work and the firmness of his convictions. These were the values that John Adams absorbed before he could articulate them, values that would define and sometimes torment him for the rest of his life. His father had ambitions for him that extended beyond the farm. The deacon wanted his son to enter the ministry, the most prestigious calling available to a young man of limited means in colonial Massachusetts. Adams enrolled at Harvard College in 1751 at the age of 16, and the experience transformed him. He discovered in Cambridge's modest library a world of ideas that the Braintree fields had never suggested: classical philosophy, English common law, the political theory of Locke and Harrington, the histories of Greece and Rome. He was a voracious and undisciplined reader, consuming books with the same physical energy he brought to farm labor. And what he found in those pages was not the theology his father had hoped for, but something closer to jurisprudence. By the time he graduated in 1755, Adams had decided to study law. The decision disappointed his father, though the deacon accepted it with the pragmatic grace of a man who understood that children ultimately become themselves. Adams read law under James Putnam in Worcester, spending 2 years in that inland town before returning to Braintree to be admitted to the bar in 1758. His early legal career was slow and uncertain, as all early legal careers are, built on small disputes and minor cases in the county courts. He was ambitious, but not yet distinguished, hungry for recognition, but not yet sure how to earn it. He socialized, he argued. He filled his diary with self-critical observations about his own laziness and vanity that reveal, even at this early age, the extraordinary capacity for self-examination that would characterize him throughout his life. Boston in the 1760s was a city in the early stages of a political fever. The British Parliament's passage of the Stamp Act in 1765 sent a shock through the colonial body politic that Adams felt as both a lawyer and a patriot. He responded with a series of essays, later known as the Dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law, that argued with fierce intellectual clarity that the colonists' rights as Englishmen were being systematically violated. The essays circulated widely and established Adams as a serious political thinker, a man whose opposition to British policy was grounded not in mob emotion, but in constitutional principle. He was not a man of the streets in the way that his cousin Samuel Adams was. He lacked the instinct for popular theater that made Samuel so effective as an agitator. But he was something the revolutionary movement needed just as urgently. A lawyer who could make the case in language that courts and parliaments would have to take seriously. The tension between principle and popularity that would define Adams's entire public life announced itself with particular force in the winter of 1770. On the night of March 5th, a confrontation between a crowd of Boston citizens and a small detachment of British soldiers on King Street ended in gunfire. 5 colonists were killed. The event, quickly named the Boston Massacre by those who understood its propaganda value, inflamed the city and the colonies beyond it. The soldiers responsible were arrested and faced trial for murder. And in the charged atmosphere of a city demanding vengeance, John Adams agreed to defend them. The decision was not made lightly. Adams understood exactly what it would cost him. His legal practice, his political standing, his reputation among the patriots whose cause he genuinely shared. All of these were placed at risk by the choice to represent men whom Boston had already convicted in the court of public opinion. He accepted the case, he later wrote, because he believed that no man should be denied a competent defense, and because he believed that the rule of law was not a convenience to be applied selectively, but the foundation on which everything else, including the revolution itself, would have to rest. If the colonists were fighting for the rights of Englishmen, then those rights had to mean something even when they were inconvenient. The trial that followed in the autumn of 1770 was one of the most consequential legal proceedings in colonial American history. Adams prepared with the meticulous thoroughness that characterized everything he did, examining witnesses, studying the physical evidence, constructing an argument that distinguished between the soldiers' individual culpability and the broader political context in which the confrontation had occurred. He argued that the crowd had been threatening and provocative, that the soldiers had acted under conditions of genuine fear, and that the law required the jury to consider the specific facts of each case rather than the general grievance of a city in mourning. His closing argument, delivered with the controlled passion of a man who believed every word he was saying, became one of the celebrated forensic performances of the colonial era. He quoted the legal maxim that facts are stubborn things, and argued that neither wishes nor passions could alter the state of facts and evidence. The jury acquitted the officer in command, Captain Thomas Preston, and acquitted 6 of the 8 soldiers. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, and were branded on the thumb, a punishment that, by the standards of the time, amounted to a lenient outcome. Adams had done what he set out to do. He had secured a verdict that the evidence supported in a city that had wanted something very different. The political cost was immediate and real. Adams lost clients. He was denounced in the streets and in the press. The popular anger that Samuel Adams had so carefully cultivated found a convenient target in his principled cousin. John Adams endured the criticism with the stoic determination of a man who had made his calculation and accepted its consequences, but his diary from this period reveals the private toll. He was not indifferent to public opinion. He craved recognition with an intensity that he spent his entire life trying to master, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing provided only partial consolation for the loss of popular affection. What the Boston Massacre trial revealed about John Adams was something that would prove both his greatest strength and his most persistent political liability. He was constitutionally incapable of choosing the popular course when he believed it to be the wrong one. This was not a performance of virtue. It was simply how he was made. The same New England soil that had taught him stubbornness had also taught him that a man's word and a man's principles were the only things that genuinely belonged to him, the only things that could not be taken away by circumstance or misfortune. He would spend the next 5 decades demonstrating this truth in contexts far larger and more consequential than a Boston courtroom, and the republic he helped build would be shaped, in ways both visible and invisible, by the particular quality of his conscience. By the early 1770s, Adams was established in Boston, married to the remarkable Abigail Smith of Weymouth, and increasingly consumed by the political crisis that was moving, with the terrible logic of accumulated grievances, toward open conflict. He had been elected to the Massachusetts General Court. He was writing and arguing and thinking with the concentrated energy of a man who understood that history was accelerating around him. The farm at Braintree, the Harvard Library, the Worcester Law Office, the Boston courtroom, these were the environments that had made him. What they had produced was something the coming revolution would desperately need. A man of absolute intellectual honesty, fierce moral courage, and the kind of stubborn, unglamorous integrity that builds nations even when it cannot win elections. The rocky shore had made a patriot. Now the wider world was about to discover what that meant. Philadelphia in the late summer of 1774 was the largest and most sophisticated city in British North America, a place of broad, tree-lined streets and brick townhouses, of bustling wharves and prosperous counting houses, of Quaker meeting halls and Anglican churches standing in the same blocks with a tolerance that Boston, in its Puritan intensity, had never quite managed. When John Adams arrived in the city for the first time as a Massachusetts delegate to the First Continental Congress, he came as a man from the provinces entering a cosmopolitan world, and he was shrewd enough to know it. His diary from those first weeks crackles with the observations of a man simultaneously impressed and competitive, cataloguing the elegance of Philadelphia's dinner tables, the quality of its wine, and the intellectual caliber of the men he was meeting from 12 other colonies, men who were strangers to him, but who shared, with varying degrees of urgency, the conviction that something had gone profoundly wrong in the relationship between Britain and her American subjects. The Congress assembled in Carpenter's Hall, a modest but dignified building on Chestnut Street, and the 56 delegates who gathered there represented a remarkable cross-section of colonial America's political talent. There were Virginia planters and South Carolina lawyers, New York merchants and Connecticut farmers, men of conservative temperament who hoped for reconciliation, and men of radical conviction who had already concluded that reconciliation was impossible. Adams moved among them with the careful attentiveness of a lawyer assessing a jury, taking the measure of each man, identifying allies and obstacles, beginning the long work of building the coalitions that any legislative body requires to function. He was not yet the dominant figure he would become. That distinction belonged, in these early days, to men like Patrick Henry of Virginia and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. But he was learning the terrain. The First Continental Congress accomplished less than Adams had hoped, and more than its most cautious members had intended. It produced a declaration of rights and grievances, organized a continental association to enforce a boycott of British goods, and most significantly, agreed to meet again the following spring if Parliament had not addressed colonial concerns. Parliament had not. When the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May of 1775, the world had changed entirely. The battles of Lexington and Concord had been fought. Blood had been spilled on Massachusetts soil. The war that many had hoped to avoid had begun, and the question before the Congress was no longer whether to resist, but how to organize that resistance into something capable of confronting the most powerful military force on earth. It was in this second gathering that John Adams became, as historians would later recognize, the indispensable man of the Continental Congress. Not the most famous figure in the room, not the most eloquent, but the most relentlessly effective. He served on an extraordinary number of committees simultaneously, working with a physical and intellectual stamina that astonished his colleagues and alarmed his wife. He later estimated that he had served on no fewer than 90 committees during his years in the Congress, including the crucial Board of War and Ordnance, which effectively made him the civilian architect of the Continental Army's administrative structure. While other delegates made speeches, Adams made things function. While others debated principles, he drafted procedures, organized supply chains, and wrestled with the grinding practical problems of building a military force from nothing. The Pennsylvania State House, where the Second Congress met, was a building of considerable Georgian dignity. Its red brick exterior and white-painted woodwork, projecting the calm authority of established institutions, even as the men inside it were engaged in the most radical act of political self-determination the modern world had yet witnessed. The chamber where the delegates worked was a long room with tall windows that admitted, in the summer months, both the light and the heat of a Philadelphia July that could be genuinely punishing. The green baize tables were covered with documents, maps, petitions, and the quill-scratched correspondence of a continent trying to govern itself in the middle of a war. The smell of ink and candle wax, and the particular human warmth of many bodies in an unventilated room in high summer, formed the sensory backdrop against which history was being made with uncomfortable physical immediacy. One of Adams's most consequential acts in those early months of the Second Congress came in June of 1775, when the question of who would command the newly authorized Continental Army required resolution. The choice was not obvious, and the politics surrounding it were delicate in ways that Adams understood with characteristic clarity. The army was, at that moment, essentially a New England force. The men besieging Boston were Massachusetts and Connecticut farmers, and the most experienced officers available were from those colonies. But Adams grasped something that many of his New England colleagues had not yet fully absorbed, that a war for American independence could not be won by New England alone, and that a commander from New England would never command the full loyalty of Virginia and South Carolina and the middle colonies whose participation was essential. The army needed a Virginian. More specifically, it needed the tall, silent, physically imposing colonel who sat in the Congress in his blue militia uniform, saying almost nothing but projecting an authority that the room could feel. Adams rose and nominated George Washington of Virginia as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The nomination was not universally welcomed. John Hancock, who presided over the Congress and harbored his own military ambitions, was visibly disappointed. But it was confirmed, and Washington accepted with the characteristic modesty that Adams both admired and, in his more honest private moments, recognized as a form of political genius that he himself entirely lacked. Washington rode north to take command of the forces at Cambridge, and Adams returned to the grinding work of the Congress, already thinking about the next and larger question that the war had made inevitable. The question of independence had been present in the room since the Congress first assembled, but for more than a year it remained unspoken in formal proceedings, too radical for many delegates to acknowledge openly, even as events made it increasingly unavoidable. Adams had concluded privately that independence was not only necessary, but inevitable long before he was willing to say so in the chamber. He understood the psychology of legislative bodies, that positions needed to ripen, that men needed to arrive at conclusions through their own reasoning rather than being pushed, and he exercised a patience that did not come naturally to him in service of a goal he had already fixed. He wrote to Abigail in letters that burned with the urgency of a man watching history move at a pace that felt simultaneously too fast and too slow, describing the debates, the personalities, the frustrations, and the occasional moments of genuine inspiration that punctuated the Congress's work. By the spring of 1776, the momentum toward independence had become irresistible. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January of that year, had done for popular opinion what Adams's legal arguments could never quite accomplish. It had made the case for independence in language that every literate colonist could understand and feel. The pamphlet sold in numbers that astonished everyone, and it shifted the political ground beneath the Congress's feet. Adams admired Paine's effectiveness while privately finding his political philosophy dangerously simplistic, a judgment that would prove prescient in ways neither man could yet foresee. When Virginia's Richard Henry Lee formally introduced a resolution in June of 1776, declaring that the colonies were and ought to be free and independent states, Adams seconded it with a conviction that was the product of years of thought and months of careful political preparation. The Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration that would explain and justify the resolution to the world. The committee included Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. The question of who would actually write the document was settled quickly, and from Adams's perspective, practically. Jefferson was the finest prose stylist in the room. Adams acknowledged this without false modesty, and Adams threw his considerable energy into persuading the younger Virginian to take the pen. Jefferson, initially reluctant, eventually agreed. What Jefferson produced in the weeks that followed was a document of such luminous clarity and moral ambition that it would define the terms of American self-understanding for centuries. Adams recognized its quality immediately and defended it in the congressional debates that followed with the same ferocious energy he brought to everything he believed in. The Congress debated, amended, and in some respects weakened Jefferson's draft, most painfully, in Adams's view, by striking the passage condemning the slave trade, a deletion made necessary by the political requirements of Southern delegates whose support for independence could not be taken for granted. Adams swallowed the compromise with the pragmatic realism of a man who understood that an imperfect declaration of independence was infinitely preferable to no declaration at all. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted to approve Lee's resolution of independence. Adams wrote to Abigail that day in terms that have become among the most quoted sentences in American epistolary history, declaring that the 2nd of July would be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival, commemorated with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other. He was right about the celebration, and wrong only about the date. It was the formal adoption of Jefferson's Declaration on July 4th that captured the popular imagination and fixed itself in the calendar of national memory. The signing that followed in August, as delegates affixed their names to the engrossed parchment copy, was an act of extraordinary collective courage. Every man who signed understood that he was committing treason against the crown, that the penalty for failure was death, and that the military situation of the new nation was, at that moment, genuinely precarious. Washington's army had been driven from New York. The British military machine was operating with a power and efficiency that made the outcome of the war anything but certain. The men who signed the declaration were not signing a certificate of victory. They were signing a statement of intent backed by nothing more certain than their own determination and the uncertain loyalty of a continent that had not yet fully decided what it wanted to be. Adams understood all of this with the clear-eyed realism that distinguished him from more romantically inclined revolutionaries. He had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead. The fire of revolution that had brought him to Philadelphia, that had sustained him through the exhausting committee work and the political maneuvering and the long separations from Abigail and the children, was not the fire of easy enthusiasm. It was something harder and more durable, the fire of a man who had looked at the evidence, reached a conclusion, and committed himself to its consequences regardless of the personal cost. Philadelphia had tested that fire and found it genuine. The world beyond Philadelphia would test it in ways that even John Adams, with all his capacity for self-examination, could not yet fully imagine. The Atlantic in February of 1778 was no place for a man who had never crossed an ocean. The Boston frigate carrying John Adams and his 10-year-old son John Quincy into the open sea was a vessel built for war, not comfort, and the crossing that followed was among the most harrowing experiences of Adams's life. 6 weeks of violent storms, a lightning strike that killed several sailors, a chase by British warships that nearly ended the mission before it began, and the relentless, grinding misery of a man whose body refused to accept the sea's rhythms. Adams endured it all with the same stubborn determination he brought to everything, spending the calmer hours reading, conversing with the ship's officers, and teaching his son the French vocabulary that both of them would need in the country toward which they were sailing. France in 1778 was the most powerful and most culturally self-assured nation in Europe, a civilization that had been refining its own magnificence for centuries, and that regarded the rough new republic across the Atlantic with a mixture of genuine ideological sympathy and barely concealed condescension. The court at Versailles was a world of gilded excess so complete and so elaborately codified that it constituted its own reality, a reality in which the cut of a coat and the precise angle of a bow carried political weight that Adams, formed by Braintree's granite fields and Boston's common law courts, found simultaneously absurd and impossible to ignore. Protocol was not decoration at Versailles. It was the substance of power, and those who misunderstood it paid for their ignorance in ways that could not always be recovered. Adams arrived in Paris to find that his role had already been complicated by the man he was nominally joining. Benjamin Franklin had been in France since 1776, and his presence there had become something close to a cultural phenomenon. The French adored him, his wit, his scientific reputation, his carefully cultivated image as the sage of the wilderness, the philosopher-farmer who embodied the natural virtue that French Enlightenment thinkers had theorized but never actually encountered. Franklin moved through Parisian society with the ease of a man who had spent his entire life understanding what people wanted to see and providing it, and the French responded with an enthusiasm that bordered on worship. His face appeared on medallions, snuff boxes, and porcelain. He was received at Versailles with honors that no American had previously been accorded. He had, in short, already accomplished the essential diplomatic work of making France sympathetic to the American cause, and the Treaty of Alliance signed in February of 1778, just as Adams was crossing the Atlantic to join him, was the fruit of that labor. Adams's arrival in Paris therefore placed him in an awkward position that his particular temperament made more awkward still. He was a man of enormous ability and fierce ambition who had come to do important work, only to find that the most important work had already been done by someone whose methods he found deeply suspect. Franklin's social approach to diplomacy, the long dinners, the charming conversation, the strategic deployment of wit and celebrity, struck Adams as fundamentally undisciplined, a confusion of pleasure with purpose that left the actual business of the American mission in a state of organizational chaos. The mission's accounts were in disorder. Correspondence went unanswered for weeks. The boundary between Franklin's personal finances and the public funds of the mission was, in Adams's horrified assessment, dangerously unclear. He threw himself into the administrative work with characteristic energy, organizing the mission's papers, establishing proper accounting procedures, and attempting to impose on the Paris operation the kind of systematic rigor that he believed any serious diplomatic enterprise required. Franklin observed these efforts with the amused tolerance of a man who understood that Adams was both right about the disorder and entirely wrong about how to function in the environment where they found themselves. The French did not want a scrupulous accountant. They wanted the theater of the American cause, and Franklin was its greatest performer. Adams's virtues, his honesty, his directness, his refusal to flatter, were precisely the qualities that made him ineffective in a court culture built entirely on flattery and indirection. The relationship between the two men settled into a state of mutual respect and mutual frustration that neither was quite able to resolve. Adams admired Franklin's genius even as he deplored his methods. Franklin recognized Adams's abilities even as he found his colleagues' rigidity counterproductive. Their correspondence with Congress and with each other from this period reveals two men who needed each other and could not quite manage to work together. A dynamic that would have been merely unfortunate in other circumstances, but that carried real consequences for a nation dependent on French support for its survival. Adams returned to America in 1779, was elected to the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention, and produced a document, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, that would serve as a model for the federal Constitution adopted 7 years later. Its provisions for an independent judiciary, for the separation of powers, and for the protection of individual rights reflected the constitutional thinking that Adams had been developing since his earliest legal studies, and the document stands as one of his most enduring intellectual achievements. But Congress had not finished with him in Europe. He was appointed minister plenipotentiary to negotiate peace with Britain. and in November of 1779 he crossed the Atlantic again, this time with both John Quincy and his younger son Charles in his company. The second European mission took him eventually to the Netherlands, and the journey there represented one of the most consequential and least celebrated achievements of Adams's entire career. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, had made clear that he considered Adams's presence in Paris an inconvenience. Adams's directness and his refusal to subordinate American interests to French strategic preferences made him a difficult partner for a minister accustomed to managing his allies as carefully as his enemies. When Adams concluded that Paris offered him nothing useful and that the Netherlands might offer the young republic something it desperately needed, he acted on his own initiative and traveled north. Amsterdam in 1780 was the financial capital of Europe, a city of grey canals and prosperous merchant houses, where the world's money moved through counting rooms that operated with a precision and discretion that made them the envy of every government on the continent. The Dutch Republic had its own complicated relationship with Britain, its own traditions of republican governance, and its own financial interests that Adams believed could be aligned with those of the United States. He arrived without official authorization, without the support of the French alliance, and without any certainty that his mission would succeed. What he brought was his formidable intellect, his absolute conviction in the justice of the American cause, and the same stubborn persistence that had carried him through every previous difficulty of his life. The campaign Adams waged in the Netherlands over the following 2 years was a masterpiece of patient, methodical diplomacy conducted under conditions of profound personal difficulty. He was frequently ill. The Dutch climate and the stress of his situation combined to produce a physical collapse in 1781 that left him bedridden for weeks, convinced at moments that he might not survive. He was isolated, operating without clear instructions from a Congress that was itself operating in conditions of near chaos, and he was working against the active opposition of Vergennes, who regarded an independent American financial relationship with the Dutch as a threat to French leverage over the American alliance. Adams persisted through all of it, lobbying Dutch merchants and politicians, writing pamphlets arguing the American case in terms calculated to appeal to a nation that had its own history of struggle against imperial domination, and waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that some things could not be forced. The results, when they came, were transformative. In April of 1782, the Dutch States General formally recognized the United States of America, the second nation in the world to do so after France. Adams negotiated a treaty of amity and commerce between the two republics and secured a loan of roughly 5 million guilders that provided the American government with financial resources it urgently needed. These achievements, accomplished largely alone and against considerable opposition, represented a diplomatic success that Adams believed, with considerable justification, was among the most significant of the entire revolutionary period. History has been slow to give them their proper weight, in part because Adams himself was slow to receive proper credit for anything. The Treaty of Paris negotiations of 1782 and 1783 brought Adams back into collaboration with Franklin, joined now by John Jay of New York. The three American commissioners faced a negotiation of extraordinary complexity. They were dealing simultaneously with British representatives, French diplomatic pressure, and the competing interests of their own Congress. And the outcome they achieved was, by any measure, remarkable. The treaty recognized American independence, established the Mississippi River as the western boundary of the new nation, secured American fishing rights off Newfoundland that Adams had fought for with particular tenacity, and arranged for the withdrawal of British forces from American territory. It was, in Adams's own assessment, a better peace than America had any right to expect given the military situation at the time of negotiations, and he was not wrong. The appointment that followed as the first American minister to the court of St. James's in 1785 placed Adams in perhaps the most symbolically charged diplomatic position imaginable. the representative of a nation that had fought a revolution against British rule, presenting his credentials to the king against whom that revolution had been fought. The audience with George III in June of 1785 was a moment of extraordinary historical weight, and Adams navigated it with a dignity that impressed even those who had expected to be contemptuous. The king received him with more graciousness than the occasion might have predicted, and Adams responded with the formal courtesy of a man who could distinguish between the institution of monarchy and the individual who occupied it. The years in London were difficult in ways that differed from the difficulties of Paris and Amsterdam. Abigail and their daughter Nabby had joined Adams in Europe in 1784, and their presence transformed the emotional texture of his diplomatic life. Abigail brought to the sterile world of diplomatic protocol the same fierce intelligence and practical competence she had brought to everything else, navigating the social requirements of the London posting with a skill that her husband admired and relied upon. The family's life in the house at Grosvenor Square had a warmth and domesticity that the preceding years of solitary diplomacy had entirely lacked, and Adams's letters from this period carry a contentment that his earlier European correspondence rarely achieved. But the diplomatic work itself was frustrating to the point of futility. The British government had little interest in honoring the commercial provisions of the Treaty of Paris, less interest in evacuating the northwestern frontier posts it had agreed to abandon, and no interest whatsoever in treating the United States as an equal partner in Atlantic trade. Adams pressed, argued, and protested with the methodical persistence that was his diplomatic signature, and accomplished almost nothing. The court of St. James's regarded the American minister with the polite condescension of an empire that had not yet fully absorbed the fact of its former colony's independence, and the cold marble corridors of that court reflected back to Adams the fundamental reality of his position. He represented a nation that the old world had not yet decided to take seriously. He returned to America in 1788, having spent a decade in Europe that had cost him his health at intervals, separated him from his farm and his country for years. At a time, and produced results that were genuinely significant, but rarely acknowledged as such. The Dutch recognition and loans, the Treaty of Paris, the establishment of American diplomatic presence in the major European capitals, these were real achievements, built by real labor, in conditions of real difficulty. They were also achievements that the American public, focused on the domestic drama of constitution-making and political faction, had largely failed to notice. Adams came home to a country that had moved on without him, to a political landscape reshaped by forces he had not been present to influence, and to the particular loneliness of a man who had done important work in obscurity, and found that obscurity had a way of becoming permanent. What Europe had given him, beyond the achievements themselves, was a perspective on the American experiment that no amount of domestic political experience could have provided. He had seen the courts of kings, the mechanisms of aristocratic power, the way that old societies calcified around privilege and hierarchy until reform became impossible without violence. He had seen what America was not, and the vision had deepened his commitment to what America might become, if it could resist the temptations that had corrupted every republic that had preceded it. He came home carrying that knowledge like ballast, heavier and more useful than anything he had packed in his trunks on the Boston frigate 16 years before, when he had first crossed the cold Atlantic toward the distant shore. There is a particular quality of silence that settles over a house when one of its essential inhabitants is absent. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of expectation, of rooms that remember a presence and wait for its return. The farmhouse at Braintree, and later the larger house at Quincy that the Adams family called Peacefield, knew that silence for years at a time, sometimes for stretches so long that the waiting itself became a kind of permanent condition. Abigail Adams learned to live inside that silence, to fill it with labor and intelligence and the disciplined intimacy of the written word. What she and John produced across those years of separation, more than 1,100 letters exchanged over the course of their long marriage. constitutes one of the most remarkable correspondences in American literary and political history, a record of two minds in constant conversation across distances that the 18th century made genuinely formidable. They had found each other in the early 1760s, when John Adams was a young lawyer of uncertain prospects, and Abigail Smith was the daughter of a Weymouth minister, whose household had given her something that formal education would have provided had the world been arranged differently. She had read voraciously and independently, moving through her father's library with the same hungry purposefulness that Adams had brought to Harvard's shelves, and what she had assembled from those years of self-directed study was a mind of genuine distinction. Analytically sharp, morally serious, politically acute, in ways that the conventions of her era conspired to make invisible. Adams recognized her quality immediately. Their courtship, conducted partly in person and partly through letters that already showed the characteristic energy of their later correspondence, was the courtship of two people who had found in each other the rarest of things, an intellectual equal who was also a genuine companion. They married in October of 1764, and for the first years of their life together, the separations were brief, and the farm at Braintree was the center of a domestic world that both of them found genuinely sustaining. Adams farmed, practiced law, and began his political career. Abigail managed the household, bore their children, Abigail, John Quincy, Susanna, Charles, and Thomas, and read everything she could find. The partnership that developed between them in those early years was not the conventional arrangement of the era, in which a husband's public life and a wife's domestic life occupied entirely separate spheres. Adams consulted Abigail on political questions with a seriousness that he extended to very few men, and she offered opinions that were sharper and more strategically sophisticated than most of what he received from his male colleagues. She saw around corners that his more rigid honesty sometimes prevented him from navigating. When the demands of the Continental Congress first took Adams to Philadelphia in 1774, the correspondence that had always been a feature of their relationship became its primary medium. The letters that began flowing between Braintree and Philadelphia, and later between Massachusetts and the various European capitals where Adams spent his diplomatic years, were written under conditions that both parties understood to be imperfect. Letters took weeks to arrive, were sometimes lost entirely, were occasionally intercepted and read by hostile eyes, and always arrived carrying news that was already old by the time it reached its destination. Both Adams and Abigail wrote with the awareness that they were communicating across a gap that no amount of eloquence could entirely bridge, and that awareness gave their letters a particular urgency, a quality of saying the essential thing, because the opportunity to say anything at all was too precious to waste on the peripheral. Adams's letters from Philadelphia and later from Paris and Amsterdam and London described the world he was moving through with the observational precision of a man who knew his wife would want the full picture, the personalities of his fellow delegates, the quality of the arguments being made in committee, the physical appearance of Versailles, the financial mechanisms of Amsterdam's counting houses, the barely concealed contempt of the British court. He wrote to her as he wrote in his diary, with a directness and a willingness to expose his own anxieties and frustrations that his public persona rarely permitted. The letters are full of self-doubt and ambition, of loneliness and conviction, of the particular ache of a man who loved his farm and his family with a physical intensity, and found himself perpetually separated from both by the demands of a cause he could not abandon. Abigail's letters, in return, were something more than domestic reports, though they contained those as well, detailed accounts of the farm's management, the children's progress, the prices of goods in Boston, the movements of British troops in the surrounding countryside. She managed the Braintree farm through years of wartime disruption with a competence that Adams acknowledged freely and depended on absolutely. She negotiated with tenants, managed accounts, made decisions about planting and livestock and property that would have been considered entirely outside a woman's proper domain by most of her contemporaries. And she did all of it while raising 5 children largely alone and maintaining the intellectual life that was as necessary to her as food. The farm survived. The children were educated. The finances, though perpetually strained, were kept from collapse. These were not small achievements in the context of a revolutionary war that was disrupting every ordinary system of colonial life. But Abigail's letters were also political documents of considerable sophistication. She followed the debates in Congress and later the diplomatic developments in Europe with the attentiveness of someone who understood that these events were not abstractions, but forces that would determine the shape of the world her children would inhabit. She offered Adams assessments of public opinion in Massachusetts that were more accurate than much of what he received from official sources. She warned him when his positions were becoming politically vulnerable, urged him toward pragmatism when his principled stubbornness threatened to isolate him, and pushed him toward greater moral ambition when she believed the moment required it. The most celebrated of all her letters arrived in Philadelphia in the spring of 1776, as Adams and his colleagues were moving toward the momentous decision for independence. Abigail wrote to him with a directness that was characteristic of their correspondence, but that carried, in this instance, a weight that has only grown with time. She urged him, in framing the new code of laws that the Congress would inevitably need to produce, to remember the ladies, to be more generous and favorable to them than the ancestors had been, and to refuse to put unlimited power into the hands of husbands. She noted with a dry precision that her husband recognized as entirely serious, that women would not hold themselves bound by laws in which they had no voice or representation. She was extending the revolutionary logic of consent and representation to its natural conclusion, applying to women the same principles that the Congress was applying to the colonies in their relationship with Britain. Adams's response was affectionate and dismissive in roughly equal measure. He teased her about the idea of women in politics, suggested that the men of the Congress were already sufficiently threatened by other groups demanding their rights, and deflected the substance of her argument with the humor that he deployed when he was not prepared to engage directly. Abigail was not deceived by the deflection. She knew her husband well enough to understand that his teasing was not contempt, but discomfort, the discomfort of a man who recognized the logical force of an argument he was not yet prepared to act upon. She pressed the point in subsequent letters, and the exchange between them on this question stands as one of the most revealing documents of the revolutionary era, revealing not only about Abigail's remarkable political intelligence, but about the limits that even the most enlightened men of the founding generation placed on their own revolutionary principles. The years of European diplomacy brought the correspondence to its most intense and most melancholy register. Adams was gone for years at a time, separated from Abigail by an ocean that 18th century technology made genuinely vast. Letters took months to arrive. Some never arrived at all. The emotional cost of the separation was real and documented in both directions. Adams wrote of his loneliness with a rawness that his public persona never permitted, and Abigail's letters from this period carry a weight of accumulated absence that no amount of philosophical acceptance could entirely conceal. She had not wanted him to go. She understood why he had to, accepted the necessity with the same clear-eyed realism that characterized everything she did, and grieved the loss privately while managing everything publicly. When Abigail finally joined Adams in Europe in 1784, the reunion after years of separation carried an emotional intensity that both of them expressed in terms that make clear how much the distance had cost them. She adapted to the European diplomatic world with the same competence he had brought to the Braintree farm, navigating the social requirements of Paris and London with a shrewdness that impressed even those who had expected to find an American provincial. She saw through the gilded surfaces of European court life with the same penetrating clarity she brought to everything, and her letters home from this period are among the most vivid accounts of European society written by any American of the founding generation. The correspondence that sustained them across all those years of separation was not merely a record of their relationship. It was, in a very real sense, the relationship itself. the medium through which two people of exceptional intelligence maintained the intellectual and emotional communion that was the foundation of everything else between them. The letters are the marriage, as much as any of the years they spent in the same house, farming the same land, sitting by the same fire. They are also something more than a marriage. They are a document of the revolutionary era seen from two vantage points simultaneously: the public world of politics and diplomacy, and the private world of a household holding itself together against the centrifugal force of history. Together, those vantage points produce a picture of the founding period that neither could have provided alone. The candle burning in a cold Quincy study, the quill moving across paper in a Philadelphia boarding house, the ship carrying words across the winter Atlantic. These are the images of a partnership that built a nation one letter at a time. He had helped ignite a revolution, negotiated a peace that secured a continent, and spent a decade representing his country in the courts of Europe's most powerful monarchies. Now John Adams would preside over a chamber where his primary constitutional function was to sit quietly and wait for a tie. On April 13, 1789, Adams departed his native Braintree for New York City, where the new federal government was assembling itself with the self-conscious grandeur of an institution determined to project permanence from its very first moments. The journey south carried him through a landscape still bearing the marks of the war that had made this moment possible. Farmland slowly recovering, roads rutted by years of military traffic, towns rebuilding the ordinary rhythms of commerce and community that revolution had disrupted. Adams made the journey with the mixed emotions of a man who had earned his position through decades of genuine sacrifice, and who understood, with the clear-eyed realism that was his most consistent characteristic, that the position itself was almost entirely without substance. The electoral mathematics of 1789 had been straightforward. George Washington received all 69 electoral votes cast, a unanimous endorsement that reflected both his genuine stature and the political calculation of a founding generation determined to begin the Republic without the taint of contested ambition. Adams received 34 votes, the second highest total, and thus became the first vice president of the United States under the original constitutional rules that awarded the office to the runner-up. Alexander Hamilton, already maneuvering with the strategic instinct that would make him both indispensable and dangerous, had quietly worked to ensure that Adams's total remained comfortably below Washington's, preventing any appearance of a challenge to the general supremacy. Adams was aware of this manipulation and filed it away with the careful attention he gave to all evidence of Hamilton's methods. Federal Hall in New York gleamed with patriotic optimism in the spring of 1789. The building had been renovated specifically for the new government's use, its facade freshly painted, its chambers fitted with the furniture of Republican dignity, dark wood, clean lines, the deliberate aesthetic of a nation that had rejected monarchical excess without yet settling on what it wanted to put in its place. The streets outside were crowded with citizens who had traveled considerable distances to witness the inauguration of something genuinely unprecedented, a constitutional republic of continental scale, attempting to demonstrate that self-governance was not merely a philosophical proposition, but a practical possibility. The atmosphere crackled with the particular electricity of a moment that everyone present understood to be historic. Adams delivered his address to the Senate with the warmth and gratitude of a man who meant every word he said. He expressed genuine pride in being counted among the defenders of liberties, thanked the delegates who had constructed the Constitution with the care and intelligence the moment had demanded, and promised to follow that document to the fullest extent of his abilities. The senators received his remarks with the respectful attention due to a man of his stature and service. Then they immediately launched into a discussion that revealed, with almost comic precision, exactly what the vice presidency was actually going to be. The question before the Senate in those first days was not policy or legislation or any of the great constitutional questions that Adams had spent his career preparing to address. The question was protocol. How should the president be addressed? How should the vice president be addressed? What were the precise ceremonial obligations of each office, and how should they be performed? Adams threw himself into these deliberations with an enthusiasm that his colleagues found puzzling, and that history has found mildly embarrassing. He advocated for titles of considerable grandeur. His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their liberties was one formulation that circulated, arguing that the dignity of the executive office required formal honorifics of the kind that European courts employed. The Senate ultimately settled on the plain Republican simplicity of Mr. President, and Adams's advocacy for elaborate titles earned him the nickname his rotundity from critics who found the whole episode revealing about his instincts. It was, in retrospect, a revealing episode, but not quite in the way his critics suggested. Adams's concern with titles and protocol was not mere vanity, though vanity was certainly present. It reflected a genuine and sophisticated worry about the fragility of Republican institutions in a world that had never successfully sustained them at continental scale. He had read enough history to know that republics failed, that they failed in predictable ways, and that the mechanisms of dignity and ceremony that surrounded executive power served real functions in maintaining the authority that effective governance required. He was not wrong about the principle. He was simply wrong about the specific application, and the gap between his theoretical sophistication and his practical political judgment was one that would cost him throughout his public life. The constitutional reality of the vice presidency settled over Adams with the slow weight of genuine disappointment. He presided over the Senate with the formality and scrupulous impartiality that the role demanded, and he performed that function with a conscientiousness that the office's history would later recognize as foundational. He cast the tie-breaking vote at least 31 times during his 8 years in the position, more than any vice president before or since, and several of those votes were consequential, touching questions of executive power, foreign policy, and the organization of the new government that would shape American governance for generations. But the casting of tie-breaking votes, however significant in aggregate, was not the work that Adams had imagined himself doing. He had spent decades in the thick of events, arguing and deciding and shaping outcomes through the force of his intellect and his will. Now he sat elevated above the chamber's proceedings, constitutionally prohibited from participating in the debates below him, watching other men argue questions that he had opinions about and was not permitted to express. He described the office, in a formulation that has followed him through history, as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. The characterization was both accurate and slightly unfair. The vice presidency was not insignificant in its potential, as Adams's own subsequent elevation to the presidency demonstrated, but it was genuinely insignificant in its daily exercise, and Adams was not a man built for ceremonial patience. His mind required engagement. His temperament required combat. The Senate chamber gave him neither, as the capital moved from New York to Philadelphia in 1790. The political landscape of the new republic was hardening into the factional shapes that would define American politics for generations. The great fault line ran between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, between the Federalist vision of a strong central government, a national bank, and close commercial ties with Britain, and the Republican vision of agrarian democracy, states' rights, and sympathy with revolutionary France. Adams occupied an uncomfortable position in this emerging division. His Federalist instincts aligned him broadly with Hamilton on questions of governmental structure and executive power, but his independence of mind and his deep suspicion of Hamilton's methods kept him from becoming the New Yorker's reliable ally. Jefferson had been his friend and colleague in the Revolutionary years, but Jefferson's increasingly romantic enthusiasm for the French Revolution struck Adams as dangerously naive, a failure to learn the lessons that history offered about the difference between liberty and license. The French Revolution's impact on American political culture was destabilizing in ways that Adams watched with mounting anxiety. when the revolution's early promise of constitutional reform gave way to the terror, to the systematic violence of the guillotine and the mob, Adams found his worst fears about democratic excess confirmed in the most graphic possible terms. He had always believed that democracy without institutional constraint was not freedom, but a different form of tyranny, and the spectacle of revolutionary France consuming its own citizens in the name of liberty seemed to him a validation of everything he had argued in his defense of the constitutions of government of the United States, a massive and largely unread work he had produced during his London years. The book's argument for balanced government, for the necessity of checking popular passion with institutional structure, had been poorly received in an America intoxicated with revolutionary enthusiasm. Now the streets of Paris were running with blood, and Adams felt the grim satisfaction of a man whose warnings had been ignored. But the satisfaction was cold comfort in a political environment where enthusiasm for France had become a marker of Republican virtue and skepticism about France had become evidence of monarchical sympathy. Adams's nuanced position, supportive of the French people's aspirations, horrified by the revolution's methods, deeply worried about the implications for American political culture, was too complex for the emerging partisan framework to accommodate. He was accused of aristocratic tendencies by Jefferson's allies and found insufficiently committed to Federalist orthodoxy by Hamilton's. The isolation that had always been a feature of his temperament became a structural condition of his political situation. Washington's decision to retire after 2 terms set the stage for the election of 1796, the first genuinely contested presidential election in American history. The Federalists nominated Adams and Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina. The Republicans nominated Jefferson. Hamilton, still maneuvering behind the scenes with the strategic restlessness that Adams had learned to distrust, worked quietly to elevate Pinckney above Adams in the electoral count, a repetition of the manipulation he had attempted in 1789, this time with higher stakes and more transparent motives. Adams was aware of the scheme and furious about it, but he refused to engage in the counter-maneuvering that might have protected him, because counter-maneuvering required the kind of political calculation that his constitution simply would not permit. The result was the closest presidential election the young republic had yet experienced. Adams won with 71 electoral votes. Jefferson received 68, which under the original constitutional rules made him vice president, a result of almost surreal awkwardness, placing the leader of the opposition party 1 heartbeat from the presidency he had just lost. The population of the United States, the moment of Adams's election, stood at roughly 4,900,000 souls, a young and rapidly expanding nation whose political institutions were still finding their shape, whose partisan divisions were still hardening into permanent form, and whose relationship with the great powers of Europe was moving toward a crisis that would define Adams's presidency before he had fully settled into the office. He had spent 8 years in the awkward throne of the vice presidency, presiding over a chamber where his authority was largely ceremonial. Watching the Republic he had helped develop in directions that sometimes alarmed him, maintaining his dignity and his principles in an environment that rewarded neither. The experience had not broken him. It had not even quite embittered him, though it had deepened the streak of melancholy that had always run beneath his more combative surface. What it had given him, beyond the frustration and the isolation, was 8 years of close observation of how the new government actually functioned, its mechanisms, its vulnerabilities, its susceptibility to faction and passion, and the corrupting influence of ambition. He was about to need every lesson those years had taught him. The presidency that awaited him in 1797 would test everything he had learned, everything he believed, and everything he was willing to sacrifice for the Republic, whose awkward, unglamorous, essential work had been his life's consuming purpose. In the spring of 1797, a man who had spent his entire adult life in service to a nation that had never quite learned to love him stood before the Senate chamber and took the oath of the most powerful office that nation could bestow. John Adams was 61 years old, thicker and rounder than the compact young lawyer who had walked the frost-hardened fields of Braintree, his face carrying the accumulated weight of decades spent in rooms where history was made and credit was distributed unequally. George Washington sat nearby, and observers noted that the retiring president seemed almost visibly relieved, his great shoulders unburdened at last of a weight he had carried for 8 years. Adams, by contrast, looked like a man walking deliberately into a storm he could already see forming on the horizon. The storm had been gathering for years. The Jay Treaty of 1794, negotiated by Washington's administration to resolve lingering tensions with Britain, had infuriated the French government, which interpreted American accommodation of British commercial interests as a betrayal of the Franco-American alliance that had made independence possible. French warships and privateers had responded by attacking American merchant vessels in the Atlantic and the Caribbean with an aggression that escalated steadily through the final years of Washington's presidency. By the time Adams took office, French depredations against American shipping had produced losses that would eventually be estimated at roughly $20 million, a staggering sum for a young republic whose entire federal budget was measured in the low millions. The relationship between the United States and its oldest ally had deteriorated from partnership to something approaching undeclared war, and Adams inherited the crisis without inheriting the political tools that might have allowed him to manage it effectively. Those tools had been quietly removed by a man who was not in the cabinet, but who might as well have been. Alexander Hamilton had left the Treasury in 1795, but his influence over the Federalist Party and over the men who filled Adams's cabinet remained so pervasive that the new president was, in effect, governing with a staff that reported to someone else. Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, Secretary of War James McHenry, and Secretary of the Treasury Oliver Wolcott had all been retained from Washington's administration at Hamilton's recommendation, and all three maintained a correspondence with Hamilton that was more candid and more consequential than anything they shared with Adams. They were not disloyal in any dramatic sense. They did not sabotage Adams's decisions openly or immediately, but they filtered information, delayed implementation, and shaped the options presented to the president in ways calculated to align American policy with Hamilton's vision rather than Adams's judgment. Adams was aware of this dynamic and found it maddening, but he lacked the political instinct to purge his cabinet quickly and replace it with men whose loyalty was genuinely his own. The first major test of his presidency came almost immediately. In 1797, Adams sent a diplomatic delegation to Paris to negotiate a resolution to the maritime crisis, seeking the kind of direct engagement with the French government that he believed offered the best chance of avoiding a full-scale war. The delegation consisted of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina, John Marshall of Virginia, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, a carefully balanced group intended to demonstrate American seriousness and good faith. What they encountered in Paris was something rather different from the diplomatic engagement they had anticipated. The French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, one of the most accomplished and most cynical diplomats in European history, declined to receive the American commissioners officially. Instead, he dispatched 3 intermediaries, identified in the subsequent American dispatches only as X, Y, and Z, who conveyed to the Americans that any serious negotiation would require, as a preliminary condition, a substantial bribe to Talleyrand personally and a loan to the French government. The sums involved were not trivial. The bribe alone was reportedly in the range of £50,000 sterling. The loan was to be measured in millions. The intermediaries made clear that without these payments, no negotiation would take place and French attacks on American shipping would continue. The American commissioners refused. Pinckney's reported response, that it was no, not a sixpence, captured the essential American position with a directness that Talleyrand, accustomed to the more flexible moral standards of European diplomacy, had apparently not anticipated. The delegation's dispatches describing the episode reached Philadelphia in the spring of 1798, and Adams laid them before Congress with a covering message that was a model of controlled outrage. The public reaction when the dispatches were published was explosive. The XYZ affair, as it immediately became known, transformed the political atmosphere of the young republic with a speed and completeness that Adams had not expected, and that his Federalist allies exploited with an enthusiasm that quickly exceeded his own intentions. The executive mansion in Philadelphia, a handsome Georgian townhouse on Market Street that served as the presidential residence until the new federal city was ready, became the center of a war fever that Adams found himself simultaneously riding and trying to restrain. The slogan "Millions for Defense, but not 1 cent for tribute" circulated through the press and the taverns with the infectious energy of a phrase that had captured a genuine popular sentiment. Congress authorized the construction of new warships, the expansion of the Army, and the creation of a Navy department as a separate cabinet office. Adams signed these measures and supported the military buildup with genuine conviction. He believed that American sovereignty required the capacity to defend itself, and that the French had demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that they would not respect a nation that could not protect its own commerce. But the war fever that the XYZ affair had ignited was producing consequences that Adams found deeply troubling. The Federalists who controlled Congress were moving with a speed and a punitive ambition that went well beyond anything Adams considered necessary or wise. The Alien and Sedition Acts, a series of 4 laws that Congress passed in the summer of 1798, represented the most direct assault on civil liberties that the young republic had yet attempted. The Alien Acts extended the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 to 14 years and gave the president sweeping powers to deport foreign nationals deemed dangerous to the public peace. The Sedition Act made it a criminal offense to publish false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the government, the Congress, or the president, a provision that was used almost immediately to prosecute Republican newspaper editors whose offense was not falsehood but criticism. Adams signed the acts in June and July of 1798, and the decision has shadowed his historical reputation ever since. His own feelings about the legislation were complicated and, in his more candid private moments, troubled. He shared the Federalist concern about the influence of French agents on American public opinion, and he genuinely believed that some mechanism for managing foreign subversion was necessary in a period of near war. But he was also a lawyer who had spent his career defending the principle that the rule of law must apply consistently, and the Sedition Act's application, overwhelmingly targeting Republican critics rather than genuine foreign agents, was difficult to reconcile with that principle. He signed the acts reluctantly, as the historical record makes clear, and he never used the Alien Act's deportation powers, though they remained on the books throughout his presidency. The undeclared naval war that the XYZ affair had accelerated, the Quasar War, as it came to be known, was meanwhile producing results that were, from a purely military standpoint, considerably more favorable than the strategic situation had initially suggested. The new American Navy, built with the urgency that the crisis had generated, proved itself a capable fighting force. The frigate Constellation captured the French warship Insurgent in February of 1799 in an engagement that demonstrated American naval competence to a skeptical world. American warships patrolled the Caribbean with increasing effectiveness, protecting merchant vessels and engaging French privateers with a success rate that gradually shifted the balance of the maritime conflict. The Quasar War was never formally declared, never escalated to the full-scale land conflict that Hamilton and the more bellicose Federalists had privately hoped for. But it was a real war fought by real sailors with real consequences, and the United States was, by most measures, winning it. It was precisely at this moment of military advantage, when the political logic of the situation seemed to point toward continued escalation, when the Federalist Party was riding a wave of popular support. generated by patriotic outrage, when Hamilton was openly advocating for a large standing army that he clearly intended to command, that Adams made the decision that would define his presidency and cost him his political future. In February of 1799, without consulting his cabinet, without preparing his party, and without the kind of political groundwork that might have softened the blow, Adams nominated William Vans Murray as minister to France, signaling his intention to pursue a negotiated settlement to the Quasi War. The announcement landed in the Federalist world like a thunderclap. Pickering was furious. Hamilton was apoplectic. The congressional Federalists who had been preparing for a full-scale war found themselves suddenly without the presidential support that their strategy required. Adams had acted alone, deliberately, with the full understanding of what it would cost him, because he had concluded that the evidence before him, including private communications, suggesting that Talleyrand was now genuinely interested in negotiation, made peace both possible and necessary. The decision was not impulsive. Adams had been watching the situation with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades studying the mechanics of European power politics. And what he saw in the spring of 1799 was a French government under Napoleon Bonaparte that had more pressing concerns than a maritime conflict with a secondary power in the Western Atlantic. The directory that had authorized the XYZ demands had been replaced. The strategic calculus had shifted. The opportunity for a settlement that preserved American honor and avoided the catastrophic costs of full-scale war was real, and Adams was determined to seize it regardless of the political consequences. The peace commission that eventually sailed for France in the autumn of 1799 expanded from Murray alone to a three-man delegation after Adams made enough concessions to Federalist pressure to get the mission authorized, negotiated the Convention of 1800, also known as the Treaty of Mortefontaine. The agreement ended the Quasi War, released the United States from the obligations of the 1778 alliance with France, and established the commercial relationship between the two nations on a new and more stable footing. It was not a perfect agreement. The French refused to compensate Americans for the losses incurred during the Quasi War, losses estimated at $20 million. But it was a peace, and it was the peace that Adams had sought and sacrificed for. The political cost was everything he had feared, and more. The Federalist Party fractured along the fault line that Adams's decision had exposed. Hamilton, in a pamphlet of extraordinary indiscretion, published a lengthy attack on Adams's character and fitness for office that was ostensibly intended for private circulation, but that found its way into Republican newspapers with a speed that suggested either carelessness or calculation. The pamphlet was a gift to Jefferson's campaign, providing Republican editors with devastating material drawn from within the Federalist leadership itself. Adams read it with the cold fury of a man who had long suspected Hamilton's character and now had documentary confirmation. The half-built federal city of Washington, to which Adams moved the government in the autumn of 1800, provided a fitting visual metaphor for the state of his presidency. The Capitol building stood incomplete, its dome unfinished, its grounds a muddy construction site surrounded by the stumps of recently cleared trees. The president's house, large, drafty, and still damp from recent plastering, was a residence that Abigail, who joined Adams there in November, described in letters that combined genuine discomfort with characteristic dry humor. She hung her laundry in the unfinished East Room. The city around the executive mansion was more aspiration than reality, a grid of streets laid out in the wilderness with the confident expectation that civilization would eventually follow. The election of 1800 was among the most bitter in American history. Adams ran against Jefferson in a campaign that had abandoned any pretense of the civic dignity that Washington's era had maintained. Republican newspapers attacked Adams's character, his supposed monarchical tendencies, his physical appearance, and his mental stability with a venom that the Sedition Act had failed to suppress. Federalist newspapers responded in kind against Jefferson. Adams campaigned with the dignity of a man who refused to demean himself with the tactics the moment seemed to require, and the dignity cost him votes that more flexible behavior might have retained. He lost. Jefferson received 73 electoral votes to Adams's 65, carrying the South and New York and enough of the middle states to construct a majority. The Federalist Party that Hamilton had fractured never recovered. Adams received the news with a stoic acceptance of a man who had known it was coming and had made his peace with the outcome, though the private grief was real and deep. He had done what he believed was right. He had ended a war that might have destroyed the republic he had spent his life building. He had been turned out of office for it. On the morning of March 4, 1801, before Thomas Jefferson took the oath of office, Adams departed Washington in a carriage headed north toward Quincy. He left before dawn, declining to witness his successor's inauguration, a decision that has been interpreted as petulance and as grief and as simple human inability to watch the formal transfer of everything he had worked for to the man who had defeated him. Perhaps it was all three. The carriage rolled through the dark streets of the unfinished capital, past the muddy construction sites and the skeletal buildings, past the aspirational geometry of a city that existed more in plan than in reality, carrying a man who had given the Republic his best work and his most costly decisions, and who was now, at 65, heading home to the rocky shore where everything had begun. He arrived home in the grey of a March morning, the carriage wheels finding the familiar ruts of the Quincy Road as the harbour mist rolled in from the bay. The farm was exactly as he had left it, the stone walls, the bare apple trees, the old house sitting solid and unassuming against the New England sky. And yet everything about it felt different, charged with the particular quality of a place that has become a refuge rather than a home. John Adams was 65 years old, politically defeated, and free for the first time in nearly 3 decades from the consuming demands of public life. The silence that greeted him at Peacefield was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a man who had run out of battles to fight and had not yet discovered what came next. Peacefield itself had grown considerably from the modest farmhouse of his youth. Adams had purchased the property in 1787 and expanded it over the years into something approaching a gentleman's estate. Additional rooms added to the original structure. A proper study lined floor to ceiling with books, gardens that Abigail had cultivated with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything she touched. The orchards behind the house were heavy with fruit in season, the gnarled apple trees producing with the reliable abundance of things that have been properly tended over many years. The study, in particular, was a room that seemed to have been built specifically for the man who now retreated into it. Its shelves carrying thousands of volumes in multiple languages, its desk positioned to catch the morning light from the eastern windows, its atmosphere one of accumulated thought and deliberate solitude. But the solitude of those first years was not the peaceful solitude of a man at rest. It was the solitude of a man in pain, processing a defeat that touched not merely his political ambitions, but his deepest sense of himself and his place in the republic he had helped create. Adams had always craved recognition with an intensity that his principled refusal to court it made perpetually unsatisfied, and the electoral verdict of 1800 read to him in his darker moments as a judgment not merely on his presidency, but on the entire shape of his public life, on the choices he had made, the enemies he had accumulated, the popularity he had sacrificed for principles that the electorate had ultimately declined to reward. The grief that settled over Peacefield in those early years of retirement was not only political. In December of 1800, even before Adams had left Washington, his son Charles had died in New York at the age of 30. Charles Adams had been the most charming and the most fragile of the Adams children, a young man of genuine gifts who had been destroyed by alcoholism with a completeness and a speed that left his family stunned. He had dissipated his inheritance, abandoned his wife and daughters, and descended through stages of physical and moral collapse that Adams had watched from a distance with the particular anguish of a father who understood what was happening and could not stop it. By the time Charles died, The estrangement between father and son had been profound enough that Adams had spoken of him with a harshness that grief would later soften into something more complicated and more painful. The death of Charles was the kind of loss that does not resolve itself into acceptance, but simply becomes part of the permanent landscape of a life. Adams carried it into his retirement along with the political defeat, and the combination of griefs gave the early Quincy years a weight that his letters from the period only partially conceal. He threw himself into the farm with the physical energy of a man who needed occupation for his body when his mind was too crowded with sorrow to be productive. He walked his fields, supervised his tenants, repaired his fences, and planted with the methodical purposefulness of someone who understood that the land required attention regardless of what was happening inside the farmhouse. The books, however, were the true center of his retirement. Adams read with the same voracious hunger that had characterized him since his Harvard years, moving through history and philosophy and law and science with the undisciplined enthusiasm of a man who had spent decades reading in stolen hours and could now read as long as the light lasted. His marginalia from this period, the notes he scrawled in the margins of his books, arguing with authors, correcting errors, expanding on points that interested him, constitute a remarkable intellectual record, the running commentary of a first-rate mind engaging with the full sweep of human knowledge. He was not a man who read passively. He read as he had argued in courtrooms and legislative chambers, with the combative engagement of someone who believed that ideas had consequences and that bad ideas deserved to be challenged even when their authors were long dead. The letters that began flowing from Peacefield in these years were equally combative and equally revealing. Adams wrote to anyone who interested him, old colleagues, younger scholars, politicians whose decisions he found worth analyzing, editors whose publications engaged questions he cared about. The correspondence was prodigious in volume and remarkable in quality, the output of a man who had lost his public platform but retained his need to argue and to be heard. He wrote about the history of the Revolution, about the nature of Republican government, about the lessons that ancient and modern history offered to a young nation still finding its institutional shape. He wrote with the freedom of a man who no longer needed to calculate the political consequences of his opinions, and the freedom produced a candor that his public career had rarely permitted. Abigail remained the center of everything. She had returned to Quincy with him, resuming the management of Peacefield with the same competent authority she had exercised during his long absences, and her presence gave the retirement years a warmth and a stability that Adams's solitary temperament could not have generated alone. She was his audience and his critic, his domestic anchor and his intellectual companion, the person whose judgment he trusted more completely than anyone else's and whose company he valued above any other. The long separations of his diplomatic years had taught him, at considerable cost, exactly what her presence meant to him, and the years at Peacefield together carried the quality of a gift that both of them understood to be finite. Abigail's health had never been entirely robust, and the years of wartime management and diplomatic excel had taken their toll. She suffered from recurring illness through the early years of the Quincy retirement, periods of weakness that alarmed Adams and that she endured with the stoic practicality that characterized everything she did. She continued to read, to correspond, to manage the household, and to offer Adams the intellectual companionship that was as necessary to him as the farm's physical rhythms. But the illness was real, and its progression through the years after 1810 was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Abigail Adams died on October 28, 1818, at the age of 73, of typhoid fever. She had been ill for several weeks, and Adams had been present through the final days with the helpless attentiveness of a man who understood that there was nothing useful he could do, and who stayed anyway. She died at Peacefield, in the house she had managed and loved, surrounded by family. Adams survived her by nearly 8 years, and the loss reshaped the remaining portion of his life as completely as any event since the electoral defeat of 1800. More completely, in truth, because political defeat could be analyzed and contextualized and argued with, while the death of Abigail simply left a silence that no amount of reading or letter writing could fill. The study at Peacefield became his world in those final years. The scratch of quill on parchment, the morning light moving across the bookshelves, the harbor visible through the eastern windows on clear days, the particular quality of Quincy mornings in autumn when the harvest gold of the orchards caught the low-angled light, and the air carried the smell of fallen apples and cold salt water. He was old now, genuinely old in the way that the body eventually insists upon regardless of the mind's refusal to acknowledge it. His hands trembled. His eyesight had weakened enough that reading required effort. His voice, which had once filled courtrooms and legislative chambers, had thinned to something more fragile. And yet the mind burned on. The letters continued, the arguments continued, the fierce engagement with ideas and history, and the ongoing drama of the Republic he had helped create continued with an intensity that astonished those who visited him at Quincy, and found not the diminished remnant of a great man, but something closer to the great man himself, still present, still arguing, still capable of the wit and the passion and the penetrating judgment that had characterized him at his best. He had outlived most of his generation. He had watched the Republic survive crises that he had feared might destroy it. He had seen his son, John Quincy Adams, rise to prominence in American public life, carrying the family's tradition of principled service into a new era. The harvest gold of the Quincy autumns framed a life in reflection. A man who had given everything to a cause that had not always been grateful, who had suffered losses that no public achievement could compensate for, and who had arrived, through the long discipline of solitude and study, and the hard-won philosophical acceptance that only time can produce, at something that was not quite peace, but was perhaps the closest approximation available to a man of his particular temperament. The silence of Peacefield was no longer the silence of defeat. It had become something more durable, the silence of a man who had said what he had to say, done what he had to do, and was now waiting, with the patience that age eventually teaches even the most impatient of men, for history to render its verdict. Two old men, separated by more than 500 miles of American road and 11 years of wounded silence, had been slowly circling back toward each other without quite knowing how to close the distance. The estrangement between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson was one of the most consequential personal ruptures in the history of the American founding. Two men who had stood together at the creation of the Republic, who had admired and needed each other in the fire of revolution, now living out their final years in a silence made heavier by everything they had once shared. The breach had its roots in the bitter election of 1800, in the newspaper wars and the partisan savagery that had transformed former colleagues into political enemies. Jefferson's Republican allies had attacked Adams with a venom that Adams found personally unforgivable, and Adams's Federalist supporters had responded in kind. By the time the dust of that election had settled, the friendship that had sustained both men through the extraordinary pressures of the revolutionary and diplomatic years had been buried under the accumulated debris of partisan conflict. Adams's pre-dawn departure from Washington on Inauguration Day had sealed the rupture with a finality that neither man seemed willing to challenge for more than a decade. It was Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia who finally moved the pieces back into alignment. Rush was one of the most distinguished physicians in America, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a man who had maintained warm friendships with both Adams and Jefferson through the years of their estrangement. He had watched the silence between them with the particular sadness of someone who understood what was being lost, not merely a personal friendship, but the living connection between two of the Republic's most formidable minds. Rush was a persistent man, and he worked his correspondence with both men with the gentle strategic patience of a physician who understood that some conditions required careful preparation before treatment could begin. In a letter to Adams in late 1811, Rush described a dream in which Adams and Jefferson had renewed their friendship and exchanged letters of great historical significance. The dream, whether genuinely dreamed or artfully constructed for epistolary purposes, had its intended effect. Adams was 66 years old, living in the autumnal quiet of Peacefield with the accumulated weight of Abigail's declining health and his own advancing years pressing upon him. The anger that had sustained the silence had not disappeared, but it had aged into something more complicated, a grievance that he could still articulate, but that no longer carried the same heat it once had. On January 1, 1812, John Adams sat down at the desk in his Peacefield study and wrote a short, careful letter to Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. He enclosed 2 volumes of lectures by his son John Quincy, framing the gesture as a simple act of neighborly courtesy between old acquaintances. The letter was brief, almost deliberately inconsequential in its surface content, but its meaning was unmistakable to the man who received it. Adams was opening a door that had been closed for 11 years, and he was doing it in the only way his particular combination of pride and longing would permit, obliquely, through a gesture that could be accepted or declined without the full exposure of direct request. Jefferson received the letter at Monticello, the magnificent house he had spent decades designing, and redesigning on its red clay hilltop in the Virginia Piedmont. He was 68 years old, his own health beginning to show the marks of age, his finances in the chronic disorder that would eventually leave his estate deeply indebted. He responded within 2 weeks with a warmth that suggested the door Adams had opened had been one he had been waiting for someone to open. The reply was generous, affectionate, and entirely characteristic of Jefferson's epistolary gifts. Graceful, intellectually engaged, and carefully calibrated to acknowledge the renewal of connection without dwelling on the years of silence in ways that might make the renewal more difficult. What followed over the next 14 years was one of the most remarkable correspondences in American literary history. The 2 men exchanged approximately 158 letters, ranging across the full sweep of their shared experience and their divergent philosophies with the freedom of men who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. They wrote about the revolution they had made together, comparing memories of events that both had witnessed but remembered differently. They wrote about the books they were reading, the political developments they were observing, the philosophical questions that continued to engage them in old age. They argued, sometimes sharply, about the nature of aristocracy and democracy, about the proper structure of republican government, about the lessons that history offered to a nation still finding its way. The contrast between their physical environments gave the correspondence a particular texture. Adams wrote from Peacefield in the luminous autumnal landscape of coastal Massachusetts, the harvest gold of his orchards, the grey-blue harbor visible on clear mornings, the stone walls and spare New England light that had formed him. Jefferson wrote from Monticello against the red clay hills and dense hardwood forests of the Virginia Piedmont, a landscape of warmer colors and more dramatic topography. The house itself, a testament to its owner's restless architectural intelligence and his lifelong inability to consider anything finished. The 2 environments were as different as the 2 men, and yet the letters that moved between them carried a quality of mutual recognition that transcended the differences. 2 old revolutionaries finding their way back to the essential thing they had always shared, which was the conviction that the republic they had built was worth the cost of building it. Adams wrote with the directness and the argumentative energy that had always characterized him, his letters cracking with the wit and the self-deprecating humor that his public persona had rarely permitted. He described his own physical decline with a candor that was simultaneously rueful and defiant. The trembling hands, the weakened eyes, the body's slow withdrawal from the demands he had always placed upon it. He wrote about Abigail with a tenderness that deepened after her death in 1818, her absence becoming a presence in the correspondence, a loss that Jefferson, who had lost his own wife decades earlier, understood with the particular sympathy of shared experience. Jefferson's letters were more polished, more architecturally constructed, carrying the characteristic elegance of a prose stylist who could not quite turn off the aesthetic instinct even in private correspondence. He wrote about his gardens, his grandchildren, the ongoing construction and reconstruction of Monticello, the financial anxieties that pressed upon him with increasing urgency as the years passed. He wrote about his hopes for the Republic and his fears for it, about the University of Virginia that he was building as his final great project, about the question of slavery that both men knew was the Republic's unresolved and potentially fatal contradiction. On the question of slavery, the correspondence revealed the limits of the reconciliation as clearly as it revealed its depth. Adams had always found slavery morally indefensible, and his letters touched the subject with a directness that Jefferson's more elaborate rationalizations could not quite match. Jefferson acknowledged the evil in terms that were philosophically sophisticated and practically evasive, a combination that Adams recognized and did not press too hard, understanding that some arguments could not be won in letters between two old men, and that the friendship was worth more than the satisfaction of forcing a confrontation that would resolve nothing. The Republic they had built was changing around them as they wrote. The generation that had made the Revolution was passing from the scene, replaced by men who had inherited the institutions without the formative experience of creating them. Both Adams and Jefferson watched these developments with the anxious attention of founders who understood that their creation was not self-sustaining, that it required the same quality of principled commitment in each succeeding generation that they had brought to its construction. They shared the hope and the uncertainty in equal measure, two old men peering into a future they would not live to see, trying to read its shape from the evidence available to them. Adams's physical world had contracted to the dimensions of Peacefield and its immediate surroundings, but his mental world remained as expansive as it had ever been. Visitors who made the journey to Quincy to pay their respects to the last surviving member of the revolutionary generation found a man who was genuinely old. The white hair, the trembling hands, the bent posture of a body that had carried its burdens for 90 years, but whose eyes still burned with the intelligence and the combative energy that had characterized him throughout his life. He received them with the warmth and the wit of a man who had made his peace with the shape of his own story, who had arrived at the kind of philosophical acceptance that only the very long view makes possible. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence fell on July 4, 1826. The date had acquired a mythological significance in American public life, and the nation prepared to mark it with the celebrations that Adams had predicted in his famous letter to Abigail 50 years before. The parades and the bonfires and the illuminations from one end of the continent to the other. Both Adams and Jefferson were still alive as the anniversary approached, the two surviving signatories of the Declaration, the last living links to the moment of founding. The coincidence was not lost on anyone, and the nation watched the health of both men with the particular attentiveness reserved for symbols. Jefferson died at Monticello on the afternoon of July 4, 1826, a few hours after noon. He had been gravely ill for weeks, and those around him had worked to keep him alive until the anniversary, a goal that was achieved with hours to spare. He died in the house he had built and rebuilt, on the red clay hilltop he had loved, surrounded by family and the accumulated evidence of a life of extraordinary range and achievement. Adams died at Peacefield later that same afternoon, as the July light was beginning to angle toward evening. His last reported words, "Thomas Jefferson survives," were spoken in the belief that his old friend and renewed companion was still alive in Virginia. He was wrong about the fact and right about the essential thing. Jefferson did survive, in the letters and the documents and the institutions that both men had spent their lives building. Adams himself survived in the same way in the Massachusetts Constitution, in the arguments for independence, in the letters to Abigail, in the peace that had ended the Quaker War, in the independent judiciary, whose importance he had understood before almost anyone else. The parallel deaths on the Republic's 50th birthday struck the nation as something beyond coincidence, as a kind of consecration, history arranging itself into a shape that no novelist would have dared to construct. Two old men, reconciled at last, departing together on the day their greatest work had been born. What does it mean to build something meant to outlast you? To lay foundations in the certain knowledge that you will never see the structure completed, that the people who inhabit it will have forgotten the difficulty of the digging, that history will assign the credit unevenly and the blame with equal imprecision. John Adams spent his entire public life answering this question through action rather than philosophy, and the answer he gave, stubborn, unglamorous, and entirely characteristic, was that it means doing the work anyway, regardless of recognition, regardless of cost, regardless of the verdict that your own era is likely to render. The verdict his own era rendered was harsh. Adams left the presidency in 1801 as a man his contemporaries had largely concluded was difficult, vain, politically tone-deaf, and constitutionally unsuited to the demands of democratic leadership. The Federalist Party he had led fractured beyond recovery. The peace he had made with France, the decision that had cost him his second term, was acknowledged as necessary by almost everyone and credited to him by almost no one. Jefferson's democratic-republican ascendancy reshaped the political culture of the young republic in ways that made Adams's brand of principled, institutional conservatism seem like a relic of an earlier and less enlightened moment. He retreated to Quincy, carrying the particular loneliness of a man who had been right about things that his era was not yet prepared to acknowledge. History, operating on its own slower schedule, has been considerably more generous. The reassessment of Adams's legacy has been gradual and cumulative, building through the 19th and 20th centuries as scholars and citizens gained the distance necessary to evaluate his contributions against the full sweep of what the Republic became. The publication of David McCullough's biography, simply titled John Adams, in 2001, marked a significant moment in that reassessment, a work of narrative history that reached audiences far beyond the academy, that translated the complexity and the humanity of Adams's story into terms that a broad American readership could engage with and feel. The book spent years on bestseller lists and generated a renewed popular interest in the second president that his own lifetime had never produced. The HBO miniseries that followed in 2008, starring Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney as John and Abigail, directed by Tom Hooper and adapted from McCullough's biography, brought Adams's story to millions more, completing a rehabilitation that the man himself had always believed history would eventually provide, though he had not expected to wait quite so long. What the longer view reveals is a legacy of remarkable depth and durability. The Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which Adams drafted almost entirely alone, was the most sophisticated constitutional document produced by the revolutionary generation before the Federal Constitution of 1787, and its influence on that later document was direct and substantial. Its provisions for an independent judiciary, for the separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers, for the protection of individual rights against governmental overreach. These were not merely theoretical propositions. They were practical mechanisms, tested in the governance of a real state, refined through Adams's decades of legal and political experience, and carried forward into the federal framework that has governed the United States ever since. The defense of judicial independence was perhaps Adams's most consequential and least celebrated contribution to American constitutionalism. He understood, with a clarity that derived from his legal training and his reading of history, that a republic's survival depended on the existence of institutions capable of resisting the passions of the moment, courts that could say no to majorities, judges whose tenure was secure enough to permit honest judgment. His appointment of John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the final months of his presidency was an act of institutional foresight whose consequences extended across generations. Marshall's court would go on to establish the doctrine of judicial review, to define the scope of federal power, and to shape the constitutional architecture of the Republic in ways that Adams could not have fully anticipated, but that reflected precisely the principles he had spent his career defending. The rocky Braintree shore returns in memory, the frost-hardened fields, the grey Atlantic, the modest saltbox house, where a boy learned that the land required honesty from those who worked it. From that beginning to the Philadelphia State House, where the Green Bay's tables bore the weight of documents that would change the world, to the canals of Amsterdam, where Adams worked alone and ill to secure the loans and the recognition that kept the revolution solvent, to the half-finished Capitol dome of Washington, rising above the muddy construction sites of a city that existed more in aspiration than in reality, to the Peacefield study, where the scratch of quill on parchment continued long after the public world had moved on without him. Each of these environments shaped a different facet of the same essential character, the man who defended British soldiers in a Boston courtroom because the rule of law demanded it, who nominated Washington for command because the revolution required it, who sent